안녕하세요. 2019 아시아 필름 앤 비디오 아트 포럼 개막식 이후에 지금 3일 연속 논스톱으로 행사를 하고 있습니다. 저희 리서치 앤 섹션에 참여하신 데이비드 교수님 직접 상영 프로그램을 두 프로그램을 기획해 주셨고, 프로그램 1, 2 중에 첫 번째 프로그램을 1시에 상영을 했었습니다. 그래서 두 영화를 보신 분들도 있으실 것 같고, 아니면은 렉처를만 듣기 위해서 오신 분들도 있으실 것 같은데, 데이비드 교수님이 아마 그 관련해서 작가의 주권 및 저작권, 또 이 독점적 그 권력, 어떤 그 자본 혹은 왕족 이런 것 아에서 그 작가의 위치는 과연 어떤 것인지 등등의 대단히 복잡한 그런 이야기들을 해주시겠습니다. 데이비드 교수님에 대해서 아주 짧게 설명해 드리겠습니다. 현재 싱가포르에 거주하고 계시고요. 큐레이터이자 싱가포르 국립대학부 교수로서 동남아시아 현대미술을 중심으로 연구하고 계십니다. 모하우젠 국제영화제에서 언리얼 아시아를 기획하셨고요. 2009년에. 그리고 2011년에는 요키하키르 에서 비디오 포르텍스라는 프로그램을 기획하셨었고요. 또 방콕 짐 톤슨 아트 센터에서는 트랜스미션이라는 프로그램을 2017년에 기획하셨었습니다. 또 베를린에 있는 HKW에서는 부적합 루스리프식 현대성의 페이지라는 프로젝트를 진행하셨고요. 또 잘 아시는 2018년 광주 비엔날레 때에는 리턴스라는 프로젝트를 진행하셨었습니다. 큐레이터로서 참여하신 거죠. 제3 텍스트 아트 아시아 퍼시픽 또는 아트 앤 호주, 또 아트 포럼 등의 다수의 리뷰를 기고하고 계시고요. 또 싱가포르에 있는 프로젝트 플랫폼 갤러리인 퓨처 퍼펙트의 디렉터이시기도 합니다. 저서로는 굉장히 유명한 책이죠. 타이 아트, 커런시 오브 더 컨템포러리라는 책도 있습니다. 관심 있으신 분들은 찾아보시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 렉처를 시작하겠고요. 렉처가 끝난 이후에는 슈도 아브라타 생국타님을 비롯해서 어제 워크숍 프로젝트에 참여해 주셨던 이장욱 감독님, 하피즈 란차잘레, 또 응우엔타인, 존 프레스 이분들이 패널로서 참여해 주셔서 함께 디스커션을 가지도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 렉처를 시작하겠습니다.
Thank you very much, Eunhee and MMCA, and thank you all for sharing your Sunday with us. How is sovereignty communicated through moving images? What would it mean for a moving image to be sovereign? My programs for this forum set out a few artistic positions from which we could begin to answer those questions. Sovereignty in its political and historical dimensions looms as a subject of many artist-made films, but cultural and technical innovations have also refreshed anxieties about appropriation, attribution, destabilizing conventions of artistic sovereignty wherever authorship is not singular or otherwise in doubt. If that once stable individual authorship was proper to a Western liberal political history and art history, in the era of globalization and global art, its universality seems less and less assured. So what renovation of our idea of sovereignty would be necessary? My talk today suggests some ways that we might begin to recompose that idea. All right, I'm going to make a few quick preliminary notes. First, this is the beginning of an idea. It's an idea that may or may not be a curatorial idea, but I have to give a big thanks to Eunhee for allowing me really to present a mere sketch. Secondly, that the screening program that I have organized for this forum is another sketch of the same idea, quite a different one. And thirdly, that my connection to what the workshop artists are doing here is still not really very clear to me. So I think this talk might seem a little bit left field. I'm going to talk about moving images at first, but I also want to think beyond the moving image. My conversation with Yunhee began on the topic of authorship, and I didn't know at the time, or until yesterday, quite how thoroughly the workshop participants were tackling some of these questions, which are very complex. I wanted, however, to look beyond simply the spectrum of, let's say, in a more classical understanding of authorship. We have an individual author at one end of a spectrum who is, perhaps a modern creative person. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have all these other sorts of production that might be collaborative, that might be anonymous, that might be participatory, in each of which that idea of an individual authorship is blurred one way or another. What I want to do is actually think off the edge of that spectrum. I'm interested in the points where authorship sort of becomes something else, where it bleeds into some other sort of identification. A very brief outline. I'm going to start by reading a little from the curatorial text that I prepared for this gathering. It's quite philosophical. To begin with, it's about the sovereignty of art as not something necessarily always engendered by an artist, but perhaps also by the work of art itself. Secondly, I'm going to look at some moving images and show you some moving images. I'm embarrassed to say I'm going to be looking really very closely at a few moving images, and it will be clear to some of you, I think, that I'm not trained in the study of the moving image, so I apologize in advance for that. I'll do my best. But to use these films as a way to think about a certain historical setting in which the conditions of sovereignty were changing radically, and in which the moving image played a crucial role, not just reflecting those changes in sovereignty, but indeed actually realizing those changes. Finally, I'm going to think a little more expansively in a certain regional context about where else we might look for that transformative mediation. This talk doesn't really have a conclusion. I have some contemporary artworks that I might, if we have time, that I might also show you and talk about a little bit, but we'll see how we go. Okay. The work of art, writes Maurice Blanchot, does not refer immediately to the one who made it. And when we know nothing about its creation, I quote Blanchot, when we do not even know the name of the person who made it possible, it is then that the work comes closest to itself. Use, perfection, mastery, impact, immortality, none of these things are what qualifies a great work of art. Rather, what secures its greatness is a breath of infinity, that the work of the work can never be completed. I begin with this idiosyncratic and probably a bit romantic formulation for two reasons. First, because Blanchot poses here important questions for us about authorship, about the status of found or anonymous works, say, in the cinema or in other art forms, arising wherever modes of technological mediation and reproduction are shifting. Second, because he points to something that artworks carry in the absence of, independent of any author. And he calls that something sovereignty, a being absolutely. It's important for me to distinguish this from authoring more generally, the kind Blanchot calls artisanal, and into which category we would put the majority of our moving image culture, I think. And also to distinguish it from autonomy, an artwork's determination on its own terms, as Clement Greenberg might have put it, of a critical judgment, right? Or the autonomy, say, of art for art's sake. The sovereignty that concerns me here has nothing to do with this autonomy and nothing to do with aesthetic judgment. Now, sovereignty in its more idiomatic sense has two dimensions. It describes the autonomy of the expressive individual and that of the expressive state or people. These two possibilities are mutually constitutive and fundamental to bourgeois liberalism. But while they're often imagined to be universal, in practice they're only ever experienced by relatively few people in a few places. I want to set aside this kind of sovereignty too, for it excludes the sovereignty that we find in places without a fully secular liberal state. That is, authoritarian states, for example, most modern Southeast Asian states, but also and especially monarchies. So let's think beyond the political discourse and freedom of the modern, autonomous, rational Western subject, if we can. What are the non-liberal faces of sovereignty? What's the sovereignty proper to spiritual and religious power, to kingly or cultic authority? These are not powers confined to the past, even where modern neoliberal regimes seem to be well entrenched. There may be no seat in our parliament for the religious guru or the fortune teller, but if they speak through presidents, it's because sovereignty, the offices of the sovereign, if you like, preserve a much older discourse and mediumship than their modern democratic premises might suggest. Accounts of the origins of art typically begin with religion, but without authors. In sacred art traditions, we tend to think the author function was either slow to develop or permanently stunted. Works of art were consigned and inspiration for them attributed not to their maker, but to their maker's maker, to God. In monarchies, even modern ones in which secular power is separate from clerical power, this structure persists. Art historians, I think, tend to prefer telling this story from the other direction, right? The struggle of the artist to transcend their functionary or artisan status and become authorial. A good example of that at work would be an essay by the art historian John Clark called The Southeast Asian Modern, 3 Artists, where he does exactly that. So the ease with which artworks have been attributed to their patrons, I think, is also evidence here that this persists well into the modern era. I'm going to come back to this idea a bit later. The kind of, this sort of consigned authorship is also at work in our attribution of great deeds and innovations to individual rulers, a hallmark of civilizational discourse. The Khan who built the Taj Mahal, the Sultan who built the splendid gardens, the Lord whose irrigation works brought prosperity to the land. For my purposes, this is no less authorial than a modern individual artist author. And while this attributed authorship stands for a huge appropriation, or you might say expropriation of labour, measured not in days or weeks but in lives, though it might therefore offend our modernity, it's just this sort of authorship that we might call sovereign. Why? Because it's a kind of giving to and by someone who is not him or herself concerned with the practical realization of the work. It's because this kind of work is given, a consignation, Derrida would have said, because it's attributed to the ruler and not made by him or her, that it is sovereign. If the king were to roll up his sleeves and lend a hand in construction, it may be no less of a practical achievement, but it would be a very different sort of work. Now, modern arts history in Asia suggests that this kind of honorific attribution survives the emergence of a modern authorship that was individualized and, if you like, secular, and indeed that these two were often compatible. If the story of Asian modern art is, as elsewhere, one of reification and its instrumentalization for political purposes, it must also be a story of the gift, of dedication, of sovereign consignment. Now, let me break for a moment. I'm going to show 3 short videos to try to help get us in the mood, to get us feeling medieval. The first 2 are very recent. The sound is not so important. The first 2 clips I'm showing here are very recent clips. They feature the current monarch of the Kingdom of Thailand and 2 of his lady friends, one his queen Suthida and the other Sininat, who some of you may have seen was recently, this is the second one, was recently given a special title, the title of Royal Consort. This is Sininat here. Royal Consort is a title that was sort of abandoned in the 19th century. You might also have heard that within a couple of weeks after receiving this royal title, which is basically like a concubine, right, the consort to His Majesty, and here is his queen sitting next to him, officiating over the bestowal of this royal title on his consort. So I won't go into the specific political context in which this happened, but I think just simply to underscore the point that, in this case, a form of sovereign performance, if you like, is going on that we could say is in no sense modern, which is, still happening in the present. Now I'm going to show a very famous clip from news media coverage that emerged immediately after so-called Black May of 1992. This was a period of a sort of democratic uprising in the streets of Bangkok. It was led by one of the gentlemen you see here bowing and scraping on the floor. The guy on the left there, Chamlong Srimuang, was a former military man who led a popular movement, a popular middle-class movement to help to unseat a very corrupt military regime in the early 90s. Now, both, again, the context's very interesting, but I won't go into detail. What I'm interested in is just thinking about the moving image in its role of mediating sovereignty. This is the moment where the military general, who is the middle figure here, Suchinda Kapayun, is forced to come and kneel with the protest leader to have an audience with the king, basically to be scolded by the monarch. A relatively rare, very public and visible intervention in the political system, although that happens behind the scenes all the time. This was quite a shocking moment for a lot of people. Now, I'm conscious too that Thailand is probably not the best case study in a lot of ways. It's not normal. Its sovereignty is not normal. Its cinema is not normal. It's not normal to have a sovereign cinema like Thailand does. Nevertheless, I think we might learn something about the amplitude of moving images in places where sovereignty is not entirely secularized or popular or rationalized. And even when it seems it is, where older forms of sovereign investment... Where's our sound coming from? Where older forms of sovereign investment continue in politics. Photomedia images command more than just the exponential value attributed to them by a Benjamin or a Malraux. And the many others who grappled with the heady proliferation of such images in the 20th century. So obviously, this could apply to many places other than Thailand. But let me start with Thailand. However eccentric it may be to that European theoretical tradition, and perhaps even within Asia, I think the best film to sum this up, the weirdness of the Thai moving image, is perhaps this one by Apichatpong Wirasetakun. I'm going to play the film in its entirety. It's 5 minutes long. If we could have maybe lower lights, that would be great.
นี่จะเปิดเพลงให้ฟังอะไรนะฟังดูนะดีป่ะเป็นแสนเสือเหรอใช่เนี่ยเพลงใหม่ล่าสุดของเจมส์นะจำทีอ่ะนี่ไงไปให้หลวงพ่อท่านเจอมากับมือเลยนะเนี่ยสิเนี่ยขังสิฉันว่าจะเอาไปเปิดโรงหนังที่ฉันทำงานอยู่นะในโรงหนังนั้นมีคนหลายร้อยคนนะฉันว่าพลังน่ะมันจะไปถึงไกลนะถึงคนข้างหลังเลยตรงข้ามในโรงยิงว่าตรงข้ามทำอะไรอ่ะลองดูลอยข้ามน้ำแสดงว่าเมื่อคราวที่แล้วน้ำท่วมมากใช่ไหมใช่ตรงนั้นเลยข้ามน้ำมาฝนท้องก็ไม่ทันตรงนี้เลยนะตรงโต๊ะเก้าอี้นี่ฝนจะไม่ทันน้ำมาแรงแรงด้วยฝนก็ได้จ้างน้ำมันไปหมดเลยมะม่วงเธอหน้านี้มันไม่ใช่หน้ามะม่วงนี่เปรี้ยวจังเลยก็มะม่วงจ้ามาดูเหรอหน้าเปรี้ยวๆพี่ฉันว่าเธอทำน้ำปลาหวานแล้วว่าเอาไปทำน้ำพริกแทนมันเอาดีกว่าอะไรนี่จ้าสาวๆอ้าวมาถึงเร็วจังพอลงรถก็แวะมานี่เลยโอ้อ้าวของฝากจากของไทยขอบคุณค่ะมาทีไรมีของฝากจับอันเกิดอะไรล่ะของฝากเขาอ๋อแหนมกับหมูยอเจ้าเก่าเล่านี่นานี่ลงเล่นเลยนะอากาศดีด้วยนี่บรรยากาศเป็นไงเป็นน้องไทยเจอแฟนเก่าไหมเนี่ยเจอเอาไปตัดผมใหม่รอขึ้นมาแล้วแหมหน้าตาก็สดใสจริงนะเธออันนี้กินของพ่อเอาน้ำนี่ค่ะดีก็ให้แล้วพี่ดงเป็นไงบ้างก็อย่างนี้ค่ะเธอมึงเห็นรถกระบะพี่จอดอ๋อขับมาเองนะแล้วแฟนพี่นะตัดหางไปละถ้าอยู่ด้วยกันแล้วมันไม่ดีเราก็ไม่ต้องอยู่ด้วยกันถูกแค่นั้นเอง
A film with many of Apichatpong's signatures, but as usual, a film, the sort of political commitments of which are rather opaque or cryptic. I'm not going to interpret the film for you, but if anyone is interested, my attempt to do so is in the book that he mentioned, in case you care to go and look. Some of you will know firsthand, I think, that when you go to the movies in Thailand, before you see a film, activity in the cinema stops and everybody stands up, and then you watch a short movie prepared by the Palace Public Relations Department celebrating the monarch while a special royal song is played. And refusal to stand up for this ritual can land you in prison in the worst cases. So this is obviously, being a cinematic ritual is obviously not a ritual that you can call deeply traditional, but I think it underscores the weirdness and the historical singularity of the cinema's role in this sovereign context. And this film, by the way, that Apichatpong made at a time of intense political conflict, was a 35mm film originally. Now it's on the internet. I was a bit surprised to find it online, but it was made as a replacement for that, effectively. The short film that precedes a feature presentation. Okay, so a little bit of historical background on the uncommonly tight relationship between the Siamese monarchy and the medium of film. This takes us back to the fourth king, Mongkut, who was the first to be photographed, and to the return from Europe of the entourage of his son, the fifth king, Chulalongkorn, with some brothers and many attendants, with a film camera in 1898. Siamese filmmaking, film exhibition, and film discourse all begin in the palace. Royals, including some very highly placed royals, were active in the business of production and distribution throughout the cinema's early history. Their wealth, their mobility, and their ardent interest put them at the cutting edge of the new modern medium. Their absolute power and fear of Western imperialism spurred them on to rapid adoption. New film innovations were immediately reported to the king. It's hard to overstate the importance of the symbolic pact between Siamese sovereignty and the moving image. It was one of many fronts also in an anti-Chinese struggle. By the 1920s, they were already mounting a concerted effort to monopolize the already vertically integrated and to some extent Chinese-dominated industry. Their patronage was decisive. Often it included the use of royal property, huge pieces of land, for example, props, animals, vehicles. Sovereignty was also a favorite subject matter in the early cinema. I'm showing just this is really just a little collage of early films that touch on some of these things. Chang, which is a kind of adventure film in what would now be called a documentary mode, or maybe a ficto documentary kind of film. The King of the White Elephant, which is interestingly a film, this is the oldest surviving film made by Thais. It was made in 1940. It was written and produced by Pridi Panomyong, who was then finance minister actually at the time in the government of the military dictator Playak Pibun Songkram, who was arguably, but I think convincingly, we could say the new sovereign at the time in 1940. This is after the 1932 coup that had ended absolute monarchy. It was a historical drama designed basically to galvanize national consciousness and Siam's neutrality, or Thailand's neutrality, in the Second World War. This was 1 year before Thailand joined the Axis powers. More recently, we might point to the series of bloated historical epics by Chatrichalerm Yukon, actually, who is a prince. And he made a series from the early 2000s into like 2013, 2014, a series of royal epics in period, the Narasawan films. I recommend on this subject the work of May Ingawanich, who's actually wrote her PhD thesis on what she calls the heritage films of Thailand. Now I'm going to show something else. I'm going to show pieces of a film that's 32 minutes long. On the backdrop that I've just given you, the seventh king, Prachadipok, and his avid engagement with the medium of cinema is probably a bit less remarkable now. But it provides, for my purposes, a useful demonstration of this idea of what I'm calling a sovereign cinema. I'm going to show a film in which Number 7's authorial hand and initiative, if you like, will be legible. One which also happens to concern sovereignty in a straightforward way. It's a film of his coronation. It was made in 1925. His coronation was in 1925. I think the film was probably released in 1926. It was discovered in the storerooms of the Royal Railways Department, which at the turn of the last century was really one of the main filmmaking agencies in the country. And this is, again, work that's recently been sort of dusted off and restored. There's a shorter version that was circulating for some years already, which was made for newsreel purposes, which the Thai Film Archive has published online, but now they've also published this longer version, and it's a few pieces of the longer version that I want to talk about. In some respects, this is run-of-the-mill documentation. I'm going to put it on as wallpaper. I hope that's not too disrespectful. I want to put it on in the background for a while, and then I'll sort of focus on a few more parts, a few specific parts later. In some respects, this is run-of-the-mill documentation of a 1920s spectacle, in keeping with the genre that would soon be dubbed documentary. It resembles the newsreels of which the king and his friends and relatives had seen plenty overseas, and which they'd begun to commission at home. Crowds milling, flows of bodies, rituals both stately and more casual. The narrative is provided here by supposedly ancient rites, which dictate the setting, points of emphasis or focus, and so on. Seen from another point of view, it's a detailed survey not just of medieval pomp and pageantry, but also of the aesthetics of colonial modernity circa 1925, a veritable feast of art, architecture, costume, and performance that was by no means straightforwardly traditional. The impression sought, the aura, may have been one of antiquity, yet these arts and artifices, and above all their assembly into a single formatted coherent stream of moving images are unmistakably modern. The scenography of Coronation was elaborate enough as it was, but it's complicated this time round by the new technical standards and demands of the apparatus that would both take the scenes to countless destinations unforeseen by the mandarins and the Brahmins who conceived and who choreographed this event, and also afford viewers vantage points from which such a spectacle had never before been observed. And it's in light of these two displacements that I want to pose some questions about authorship, about who's responsible for that mise en scène, that composition in this moment of silent upheaval in the kingdom's economy of appearances that recalls very precisely, I think, the conflation that the anthropologist Rosalind Morris has described, in her case, in the context of a photographic history, between the power of the image and the image of power. A mise en scène not without precedent, of course. We could think, for example, of the centuries of architectural uses of painting and sculpture, and in the modern case here, framed by the hybrid Italianate architecture to which Siam's royals, at least, were already by this point domesticated. But the real significance of the footage for a wider transnational history of moving images is bound up as much with what it does not show us, all we cannot see, the specific context of modernization that would have been the far more obvious pro-filmic choice in most terrain newly conquered by the camera in the year 1925, when the relic of age-old civilizations still held sway over teeming populations. This is a quote. And the fastest of motor cars vie for popularity with the slow-pacing oxen carts, as the intertitles of another film, The Light of Asia, made in the same year in probably no less monarchic British India, were to have it. Now, this is a sacralization of both the institution of monarchy, and, albeit less obviously, of the medium, in the midst of a dramatic, rapidly advancing disenchantment, right? Modernity as disenchantment, this great sort of Weberian narrative. I'm suggesting that we're, in some sense, the cinema here is going in the opposite direction. A landscape of modern performing bodies in a pre-modern choreography, just as the first burst of motorization was transforming Bangkok, its labyrinths of canals filled in and paved as new streets, peopled with the new subjects of a progress, modern and Siamese, often attributed to the king's nationalist father, Wachirawud, and reform-minded grandfather, Chulalongkorn. Now, part of this process was the museumification of the old city. I'm thinking here of Ben Anderson's Imagined Communities. In the second edition of that book, there's a chapter called Census Map Museum, in which he describes uncolonized Siam playing catch-up in what he styles a kind of regional archaeology race. So this vista of monarchic pageantry and opulence is made to look even more officious and ceremonious, just as reforms initiated in those earlier reigns, including the demotion of an old feudal aristocracy in favor of the new bureaucracy of the state, were to climax precipitously in the constitutionalist coup just 7 years later. Okay, 1932 is when the absolute system fell. The film dwells little, actually, on these dramatic transformations, preferring this image of unaltered tradition. Again, whatever the documentary effects of the footage, we need to be careful reading the authorship of this image, which was to some considerable extent a fantasy. Prachadipok had his heart set on a military career when recalled from Europe at the outbreak of the Great War. His ascension to the throne was not exactly reluctant, but it's worth recalling the unusual circumstances that led to it. The passing in quick succession of no fewer than 5 heirs. During and since the Cold War, Thai royalists have made a very great and sustained effort to recuperate the soldier's image, not least, understandably, to ameliorate it in the wake of his abdication and exile. What's less easy to fathom, for foreign observers anyway, is that this rehabilitation should have assumed the figure of father of Thai democracy. It's true he was the author of the monarchy's concession to popular will after the 1932 coup, granting the people a constitution. It's also true he sought advice on a gradual constitutionalization, and he had other reforms in mind. But history was to overtake him with a great, terrible leap. One of his throne halls would become the coup-maker's parliament. The rehabilitation narratives are wishful at best and at worst historical fraud, an extreme makeover of the deposed monarch as progenitor of popular sovereignty. The fantastical mise-en-scène we see here continues in the work of the King Prachadipok Museum and Institute, a whole floor of which is in fact devoted to his filmmaking. Now, not only was this the first coronation to be recorded as a moving image, but it was all the more novel for both the care taken in doing so and for the fact that the agent of that caretaking was the monarch himself, a keen and reasonably able filmmaker in his own right, who'd been exposed to the medium as a boy in the palace by filmmaking uncles and their circle of cinephiles. We're almost perfectly on time. I'm just going to fast forward a little. In some scenes, we see a relatively successful translation, like those of the monarch enthroned, from the embodied perspective of an attendant. Inclined slightly upward from the foot of the throne under the royal umbrella, our gaze carried downward by a gentle pan, a lens flare that could hardly have been bettered in digital post-production, bathes the principal in an arc of divine radiance, before coming to rest then on his feet just above eye level and the heads of high officials, courtiers, and holy men attending to His Majesty. Incidentally, there's a passage I have in mind here from a great book about photography in Indonesia, about popular photography in Java, actually, by Karen Strassler, where she deals specifically with the lens flare and the lens flare's possibly mystical amplitude. But other shots register more of a lacuna or perhaps an awkwardness. It's hard to say whether it stems from technical or social protocols, when the remote viewer is placed in an impossible position vis-à-vis the scopic regimes pertaining to Siamese monarchy. I want to zoom in on this later scene that you've just been watching, a theatrical set piece or tableau vivant, prepared for the camera and clearly privileged in the montage, depicting the closure of the rites, this passage of rites in the Pratinang Paisan Taksin, which is the throne hall within the Grand Palace in Bangkok. So I'm going to just rewind a little to examine this more closely. Now the celebrants, men-at-arms in full regalia, find themselves arrayed on either side of the throne as if posing for a kind of official group portrait. The field of royal charisma makes a perfect equilateral triangle. You've already seen this image. Makes a perfect equilateral triangle described by the standing officials to left and right and the apex of the towering 9-tiered royal umbrella. The seated king perfectly centered. A pair of fans on long poles twiddled on either side, the only obvious registers of passing time. After some closer shots of the men doing their best to stand still, a three-quarter portrait politely upward again of the king on his own, his diminutive frame echoed by the seated Buddha glinting off his left shoulder. Now it's preceded by an equally aloof shot with a few rows of audience, which we've seen, the king reading from some document, and then a little way further on, which again we've just seen, our tableau appears but stutters with a series of cuts. And it takes, and possibly different takes, in which the composition seems to be tweaked and centered. We cannot know whether they were intentionally left in the reel, nor how many seconds or minutes were cut out. But it seems they were trials, that the actors or the celebrants waited while the camera was set, the composition corrected and perfected. Then, with a duration of more than 40 seconds, our tableau is the longest running continuous shot in the whole film. In this time, there's no change. There's what looks like another cut, but no actual movement in the scene, save for the twiddling of fans, a little fidgeting and the glint of regalia. A pan downward, another to the right, adjustments that seem to anticipate some coming visual event. This long take is followed by half a dozen closer details, including the three-quarter portrait that I mentioned, before returning to the tableau shot. That's right here. Held now for another 40-odd seconds as curtains are drawn, obscuring the worldly lower three-quarters of the scene, or two-thirds of the scene, screening off the king neatly, whilst keeping him at the center of a newly imposed geometry. I'm suggesting here that, in a way, the pyramidal setup that had previously defined the photographic display of majesty is displaced here by a new one defined by the cinematic proscenium, in which the umbrella becomes almost like a kind of logo, more like its current iconological function, in fact. A paragon, neither inside nor quite outside the frame, that sits like a kind of aegis above not the bodily architecture and choreography of royal charisma, but a cinematic architecture, above the sovereign medium per se. Now, all this close description is valuable, I think, not for passing aesthetic judgment and not for intuiting some kind of incipient royal cinematic decorum, although something like that was surely being consciously crafted here. I'll leave that to others better schooled in cinematography and royal protocol. For my purposes, it brings into focus the unseen viewer, or viewers, presupposed or imagined by this mise en scène. A newly privileged viewer appears here who's not witness to the ritual, not a live celebrant there in the palace, not a theatrical body, but another who sees it from some considerable remove, sees it mediated, displaced, and repeated. This scene has been shot with a camera raised up, more or less level with the monarch's head, or on a scaffold perhaps. That's not to say face to face, for the width required to take in the tableau sets it back a respectful distance, far enough, it seems, to avoid offence to His Majesty, but nevertheless eye to eye. This is an innovation we might easily overlook had we not recently been reminded that the medieval lines of sight governing appearance of the royal personage, the placement and behaviour of everyone else at such occasions, have recently been renewed. So the short recent videos that I showed prove that these protocols are not unchanging. If it's easy to conceive of the shock of someone seeing the aerial footage of the royal barge procession on the river that closes this reel, it's harder for us to imagine the impact for ordinary Siamese of this frontal view of His Highness. Not the man in uniform walking amongst his subjects, but the sovereign enthroned, rigged up in this elaborate image machine, which must have been no less shocking and novel. Both the viewfinder view and the cinema spectator's view could be said to vacillate between the theatrical and the cinematic, between the lived moment and the record, between the sovereign enactment and the enregistrement, or the recording, between the performative and the constative, if you like. If it's hard to get our heads around this, it's because we have here a medium becoming sacral. but in the name of both modernity and monarchy at the same time. At once an image of rational verifiability and of non-rational consignation, of a consecration that was to be the last hurrah of a soon-to-be profaned sacred order. For a physically present, attendant viewer, at best kneeling, perhaps prostrating. The curtain screens off the whole array completely. But for the remote spectator, granted audience and elevated to a hitherto unimaginable vantage on monarchy, a surplus remains uncovered, the umbrella, neat enough, yet visually cumbersome, with no royal figure beneath it. This is an image of the King Prachadipok Institute and Museum that I mentioned. It's in central Bangkok. It's a place you can visit easily. I'm going to move on to the last session now. Let me see if I can dig us out of this medieval hole. I want to suggest that this kind of image of power and empowerment of the image is maybe more prevalent than we'd like to think in our own aesthetic modernity. So I'm going to change gears here again, and in the time remaining I'm going to browse through some later sovereign scenographies, if you will allow the expression. From a formal point of view, I also want to zoom out to consider a wider range of media. And the historical window now will be post-war, that is post-Second World War, but still very much in this context of a flux of sovereignty, a flux that was regional and, of course, broadly post-colonial. I'm interested in the license that artistic innovators have taken in league with political principles to ignore the tastes of the people, as Boris Groys has put it, and to create for the sovereign, or the state, a new political subject and a new people. And if we're not too picky about the art forms that it takes, it will be discernible, I would argue, right across nation-building Southeast Asia. Like Harun Farocki and Prachadipok, King Norodom Sihanouk was in the habit of making films with his family. Here on the bottom left is a little sovereign, it's his son actually, the prince, in the film The Little Prince of 1967, hearing disputes, dispensing wisdom and justice in between friendly visits to the villages and a lot of bowing and scraping and foot kissing. For Sihanouk, the cinema was a means of creating rapport with ordinary and especially provincial Khmer, not in the name of the nation, but actually at the expense of their symbolic association with the state and elected officials. Sihanouk's films, fictional and non-fictional, were, as David Chandler has put it, largely about Cambodia, about its history, and about himself and his family. In Apsara, 1966, his daughter, Princess Bopadewi, performs with the Royal Ballet. In this sovereign authoring of film, what becomes of the sovereign deployment of a royal and traditional art form, like dance, one, moreover, performed by a princess? Can its status be sovereign twice or even 3 times over? Sihanouk also tried his directorial, or if you like, curatorial hand in photography, in architecture, and in spectacular mass assembly. His own sovereign status needs to be qualified. He formally abdicated in 1960, yet he remained sovereign over the cinema, barring Western film companies from entering into the Cambodian market in the early 60s, and setting up a monopolistic national studio, Kamara Pictures, under the Ministry of Information. Not only was he a sovereign producer, producing, writing, directing, starring, in every sense authoring, he also made a lot of films about monarchy and about his own monarchy. Eliza Romy has noted that his agenda was not commercial but an ideological projection, both personal monarchic but also techno-modernist. He took his films around the country, audiences would listen to a speech in the day and then see his films at night, a ritual of royal national encompassment intervening in Cambodia's varied and otherwise transnational cinema diet. Meanwhile, in and for the capital, these films, I'm going to just switch back, the top two images on the two images on the right are both stills from Apsara. And it's a sequence early on in the film where the hero is driving through the center of a newly developed part of Phnom Penh, where all the fabulous new modern architecture is showcased, and indeed the Royal Ballet, the house, the theatre that where a lot of the action takes place, is one of these modernist statements. You see it in the lower of those two images with a very distinctive roofline. So in and for the capital, films like these documented and projected a modernization, a worldly becoming, that could, with no exaggeration, be described as a sovereign scenography. Its chief agent was the Le Corbusier acolyte, now canonized by historians and contemporary artists, Van Mollyvan, whose architecture serves as an epic set for films that are basically a prospectus for Sihanouk's new modern Phnom Penh. In a similar vein, I think, we could look at Sukarno's civil engineering in Jakarta and its socialist, non-realist monuments, or perhaps the dioramas of nationalist sculptor Eddie Sunaso, who is interviewed in the 2015 video work by Tom Nicholson and Grace Sumbo, which is in my screening program. It would be hard to look past the so-called conjugal dictatorship of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, whose developmental art, so-called, took this sovereign scenography to a whole new vanguard level. For instance, in Imelda's programming at her Cultural Center of the Philippines in Manila. Here is one famous project that she commissioned by the classically trained concretist, composer, and ethnomusicologist Jose Maceda. I think art history, in its habitual focus on the state's instrumentalization of artists and curators, if you like, risks underestimating the state's own, often formidable, artistic or curatorial mandate. And the sovereign authorship that I'm talking about today, which may not be traditional, but is nothing if not pre-modern, needs to be central in our reckoning with how states have taken up that authorial mandate. Now, I have a few contemporary artworks in mind. As I said, this is right at the beginning of an idea, and I don't know whether it's going to be a piece of writing or an exhibition maybe, which I'm happy to talk about if people are interested, if people want to try to think this in contemporary art terms. I'm happy to have that conversation, but as I've taken up enough time already, I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.